And one of the things that our daughter said she'd like to do for her mother is prepare a memory photo album. And so she invited friends from kind of all across the country and down through all these years to send in a photo and a memory of something that Dorothy has done for them over the time that they've known each other. And so that's that book. And one of the submissions is what I'd like to begin with this morning. And by the way, the theme that I want to repeat over and over, and I really want you to hear, is she did what she could. This comes from Pastor Mark Royal, the pastor at the Gate Alliance Church in the Falls. He says, both my mother and father grew up in Owen Sound, and later in life after they were married, my father attended our church's Bible school in Boston, where he was getting his master's in music. While my parents were living in Boston, both my sister and I were born. My father was born in China to missionary parents, where he had been infected with a sickness which lay dormant in his body for many years, and in his late 20s, the sickness returned and would eventually take his life. Before he died, he asked my mom to take my sister and me back to Owen Sound and raise us there. My mom did as he asked, and we moved to Owen Sound following his death. My mother's family were encouraging my mom to go on social assistance and live in government-subsidized rental housing. This is what widows did in 1969. However, going against the advice of her family, my mom got a full-time job as a nurse and was seeking to buy a home to live in. The problem was that in 1969, banks would not give widows a mortgage, even if they had a secure job. Each bank she applied to explained that it was too risky to give a mortgage to a widow raising 2 children. And she finally asked one of the bankers if he knew of any person who might give her a private mortgage. He gave her the name of such a man. Mom went to see him, and I remember my mother telling me he was kind and very sympathetic to her plight, but like the banks, he thought it was too risky to lend such money to a widow. So Mom came back home, and the next day, this man called her with a question. He asked her, by any chance, are you a Christian? My mom responded that she was, and that she loved the Lord. The man told her that he was a believer as well, and that God had told him explicitly in a dream last night to give her the mortgage. So I want you to get the idea that God speaks to us very specifically, often. This is how she was able to buy our house. This is where Mom was able to raise us in a nice middle-class neighborhood. The equity Mom built in this house was a lifesaver for her in years to come. My mom died a few years ago, and I always wondered who this Christian was who had had the dream and was obedient to God when he told her to give my mom the mortgage. All I could remember was that he lived out towards Chatsworth. On Christmas Day, 2018, my mom's brother, Doug, who attends the Alliance Church in Owen Sound, texted me to wish me a Merry Christmas. He knew that Ray and Dorothy attended our church, where I now pastor in Niagara Falls, and he wrote, one thing that you may not know is that Dorothy's father is the one who held the mortgage on your mother's house. It's a small world. In this one moment, he says, it all came together. I couldn't believe it. I was never able to thank Mr. Kerr for how much he helped our family. But I was able to thank his daughter. It was the best Christmas present I could have received. Why do I tell you this story? I want to talk to you this morning about significant times in my life when I too have heard God speak to me. Heard is not really the right word. I've never heard an audible voice, Rather, it's been an impression, never more than a sentence long, and usually I wasn't looking for it or expecting it. But I believe without a doubt that it was a message from God. I've never had a dream in which God directs me as he did my father-in-law. Rather, it's a nudge, a whisper, a short sentence. We sing the song, I come to the garden alone, and he walks with me and he talks with me. And yet we rarely talk about how God has talked with us. I admit that it's staggering and awesome to think that the God of the universe, with 6 billion people to look after, would say something personal to me or to you. Yet why wouldn't he? He pays attention to details. He knows every sparrow that falls. He knows the number of hair on my head. Why wouldn't he care about communicating with me? But I believe that he loves you and me so much that he often says, or from time to time, it doesn't happen often, but from time to time, he says a word to us, a very specific word. Now, I know that he primarily communicates through his word. I don't doubt that. But today I want to focus on those times when God whispers your name and he prompts you to do some loving task for him. Now, as you listen to me this morning, you may be skeptical and but you have to decide. Were these impressions that Ray got just luck? A random event? Just a coincidence? Or is it possible that God said something to him? I believe that God, who knows us and loves us and cares about his children, speaks to us. He's our Father. He's our shepherd. And he says, my sheep hear my voice. So I want to share with you this morning. It's a personal testimony, a good part of my message, but then at the end, I will make a biblical application as well. The first time God talked with me, I was 7 years old, and it was summertime. I grew up in southern Manitoba, a little community called Morden. And I was the oldest of 8 kids, and I had just been to a summer vacation Bible school in our little one-room country school. And I don't remember what they talked about, the 2 ladies who were our teachers, but they must have said something about knowing Jesus as your personal Savior, and somehow communicated to us that there is a heaven out there, but you don't just automatically go there, and there is also an ultimate place of horror called hell. And so, as I went home that afternoon, I knew that I needed to talk to my mother, and she would explain this to me. And so, I got home, and I said to Mom, how can I know for certain, how can I be sure that when I die, I will go to heaven? And we had a little log cabin house, and she said, well, let's go upstairs and we'll pray. And so she quoted John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, and whoever believes on him will not perish, but have everlasting life. Do you believe in him? And I said, yes, I do. Do you want him to forgive your sins? And I said, yes, I do. And so she said, well then, we'll pray, and we'll just believe that he'll do what he said he'd do, and he'll become your Savior. And so we prayed that, and that's how I became a follower. And I'm going to skip many years. So the first time that I sensed God talk to me was, talk to your mother. She'll tell you how to become a follower, a Christian. Many years passed, and I had just finished grade 11. And for summer, I moved to Winnipeg to get a job. So I had this little one-room upstairs in a little house. And my job was to work for a meatpacking plant. And so they would kill the animals upstairs, and then they'd come down this chute and onto a conveyor belt. And to my right, there were guys who would cut the meat off of the bones, and then the conveyor belt carried the meat to where I was, and I would have to put the meat in different boxes for different cuts of meat. And so it was a job. And I remember so well, I should say one other little thing, and that is that my girlfriend at the time, her name was Carol, had also moved to Winnipeg for a job in the summertime. And I didn't know anybody else in Winnipeg except Carol. And so I was glad she was there because we could do stuff together, and I wasn't all alone. And so one day, as I am sorting out this meat and putting it in boxes, as true as I'm talking to you now, God said to me, I want you to give up Carol. Those exact words. And I just thought, no. I don't want that. But then I struggled with it, and to tell you the truth, I cried. I rarely cry, as you know. But my tears were falling on this meat and stuff, and so it wasn't the greatest thing to do. And I also remembered at the time that I had heard a message in which a key point was that if you serve the Lord, He will never give you second best. Now, right then, Carol to me was the best. And the thought of giving her up was really, really hard. But on the next time we were together, we did whatever we did, and then I was dropping her off at her place, and I said, there's something I need to tell you. And so I told her. And she said, well, I think it's a good idea. Because I too have been thinking that we should end this. And so we did. Some years passed, and I was at Canadian Bible College, and it was 1967. I was in my second year of Bible college, and Dorothy was in the first year. And first year students couldn't date until the Halloween date. And so in first year I dated a couple of girls, and but nothing worked out. And I was one of those guys who doesn't date a girl until he's watched her for a while, and just found out a little bit about what she's like, and I'd ask people, what's she like, and so on. And so I liked what I saw and heard. And so I'm in this history class, and how am I going to ask her out? Because it's hard to ask a girl out. And so how am I going to ask her out? What do I say? How am I going to even find her with all these students around? And so I prayed, God, if it's okay with you if I ask her out, would you, at the end of this class, put her outside that front door there, and then I can ask her. Now, before I tell you what happened, I need to tell you that Dorothy had heard about me as well, and that is that I got way too serious. I didn't just date for fun. I was serious. And so she was not running after me, she was running from me. And so I'm sitting in this history class, and finally the bell rings, and I go to the door. There she is. And so I I asked her out, and we went on the Halloween date, dressed in Hawaiian costumes, and I hate costume stuff, but I did it for her, and so the rest is history. But God put her outside that door. I believe that. I don't think it was a coincidence. We were in different classes, several hundred students, and somehow God made it happen. Again, some years pass, and we're in our first church at a place called Wawota, Saskatchewan. Wawota means much snow in Indian. And so we had this little house that the church gave us, and when Dorothy's father came to visit us, he said, "I've seen chickens living better than this." So it was just a tiny little place. But we loved the people and they loved us. And after a couple of years, they built us a nice new house. And so that was great. We moved into this nice house. We had both kids. And I remember I was landscaping. I was planting shrubs. And so it was just good. Everything was good. And I'm preaching a series on the Sermon on the Mount. And it's going well. We loved the people, they loved us. And so I'm preaching a sermon on the Sermon on the Mount. And as I am preaching, God says to me, "You're not going to be here much longer." Now, not that I was going to die, but we were going to move. And that's really an interruption when you're trying to preach. And you're going down this road and suddenly this thought comes in your mind and you think, where in the world, what's that? This is totally inappropriate. But I wasn't thinking of moving, nothing like that. We loved where we were. We loved our home. So what do you do? So I thought about it, talked to Dorothy about it a little bit. And a couple of weeks later, there came a letter. We got a monthly letter from the district superintendent, and the letter said that there's a pastor in Assiniboia who's leaving, and so it's going to be open. And just like that, God seemed to say to me, "You're going to be going to Assiniboia." And then I heard that there was another pastor much more qualified than I who was going to be candidating there, but I knew he wouldn't get it. I knew I was going to get it. And so a little bit later, sure enough, they sent us an invitation to come and candidate, and so we went. Again, time passes. We loved the people in Assiniboia. They loved us. And by the way, one of the things that I remember hearing in a pastoral methods class back then, and so this is in the late 60s, early 70s, is that a pastor should never stay in a church more than 3.5 years or so, 4 years at the outside, because you shouldn't get too close to your people. There should always be the people and then you. And so back then, people stayed in churches much shorter times than today. Because if you get too close to your people, you can't, sometimes confront them when you have to confront them. That was the thinking. So, we're in Assiniboia and we're loving Assiniboia. Assiniboia, if you don't know, is south of Moose Jaw in southern Saskatchewan. Again, farming country, loved it. And we were there for 3 or 4 years, and all is going well. And then I just became kind of restless. And I thought, maybe we should go to another place. And so there was a place in Saskatchewan called Kindersley, and another place in British Columbia who was interested in us called Surrey, where I was going to be the youth and Christian education pastor. And I just could not decide which one to go to. And we prayed and just couldn't decide. And I said, God, you're going to have to show me in some way. Please, soon, don't wait too long. And so I was reading in Micah, and Micah chapter 6, verse 1 says, Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up. Plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Now, Kindersley has no mountains and no hills. And Surrey, there's mountains and hills everywhere. So I really felt that God used his word on that occasion to give us, again, very specific guidance. So we moved to Surrey, and we had good ministry there. And so, again, time passes. And it was probably about 15 years ago, I was no longer in the ministry. I was driving a truck, a long-distance truck. And we did that for 4 years. For about a year and a half, Dorothy drove with me. And it's a tough life. You miss all the anniversaries, you miss all the birthdays of your family. You're alone most of the time. And even when Dorothy and I were together, 24/7, you are in the space of a tiny little bathroom. You have the 2 front seats and a little bunk in the back, and it's just the 2 of you all day, every day. And that's great for a while, but after a while, it's not so great. And besides, Dorothy had all kinds of aches and pains, and so it was really hard for her. And one of the things that happens with truckers is that you are often away from home for even several weeks at a time. And you don't see anybody you know, and it's just really hard and lonely. And besides, we weren't really making any money, and it was just a tough life. And so we decided that we were going to end that. And at right about that time, our son Darren said to me, "Dad, why don't you come and drive for me?" And I thought, that's a good deal. I'm going to give up this long distance trucking. But I had one last trip to make, and it was to Atlanta. And I was just really glad that it was the final trip. And I dropped my load on a Friday, and I'd be able to pick up the return load on the Monday. So I had a weekend in Atlanta at a truck stop. And it's a big truck stop with probably several hundred trucks and several hundred truck drivers. And I was lonely, far from home, with nobody I knew around. But I thought, on this last day, I'm going to go to church. And I wanted to go to Dr. Charles Stanley's church, but I had no idea where it was. And there was a great big map in this truck stop. And I knew what the address was, but I hardly knew where to find the address. And so I was standing in front of this map, and all of a sudden there was a guy beside me, a young guy. And he says, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Well, you probably wouldn't understand, but I'd like to go to church on Sunday, and I'd like to go to Dr. Stanley's church." And he says, "I know where that church is. I used to go there." He said, "Now I go to his son's church." I said, "You're kidding." And he said, No, I know exactly where it is." And so he pointed out to me how to get there, and he says, "Do you have a truck?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, their parking lot is big enough that they have a special area where trucks park." And so I just thought, wow, this is really amazing. That God seems to be looking after me, even when I'm far from home, and he knows exactly where I am. So I found Dr. Stanley's church. He had 2 services, first the early service and the second service. And I had nothing better to do, and so I decided I was going to go to both. So I went to the first one, and after the service, I was in the hall just looking around and looking at the posters and just reading kind of what was going on in this big church. And suddenly there's a lady beside me, and she says, "Are you a visitor?" And I said, yes, I'm a truck driver and just my last trip and so on. And she said, "Do you have anything you're doing for lunch?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm just kind of going to go to a restaurant and then back to the truck stop." And she said, well, one of the things my husband and I do is we always bring extra food, and we watch for visitors in our church and invite them to have lunch with us. Would you have lunch with us? And I said, yes. Now, if you're a truck driver away from home and lonely, that is a pretty good deal. And again, I just thought, God, here I am, far from home, and your eyes are on me. You care about all the little details of my life. And you've got 6 billion people to look after, but you seem to be looking after me. And I was just so grateful. So that was the last long-distance truck ride. And by this time, we were living in Niagara Falls. And we were part of Glengate Alliance Church. And the church was growing. It was wonderful. It was happy. It was healthy. And we outgrew our building, and we bought a bigger building. And we continued to grow. And we had concerts. We had great Bible preaching. We had dramas. We had Bible conferences. And we grew. And it was exciting to be a part of. And then after a little while, the pastor was of retirement age, and so he retired. And before long, something began to happen. And I still don't know exactly what it was, but people started to leave. And fringe people left. And core people, leaders, also began to leave. And they left, and they left, and they left. And it was alarming, but it was the reality. And we seem to do everything we know how to do to stop it, but it didn't seem to stop. And so it was really hard to find leaders, people willing to lead, when it seemed such a difficult cause. And then a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago probably now, the Lord said to me, Ray, I want you to wash the elders' feet and the pastors. And I just thought, wow, how do you do this? And I'd never washed anyone's feet, but someone washed my feet, and I remembered it being just an incredibly holy and humbling time. But it seems to me that when God asks us to do something, He doesn't tell me something so I can tell you something. He tells me something that I'm supposed to do. And I just want to make sure that this was God speaking to me. And so I called a couple of pastors whom I really respected. And I said, do you think this is possible? Like, is this weird? And he said, no. And I said, well, how do you even do this? And they told me how. And so I called our pastor. And I said, it seems to me that God is asking me to do this. Would you and the elders be open to this? And so he said, I'll talk to the elders and see if they'd be open to it. And they said, they decided they would be. And so he set a date. And so I began to get supplies. Because you don't normally carry things like this around. So I went to the dollar store, Dollarama, and I got a bowl, a little bigger than this. And I got a couple of pails like this for the water. And I got several washcloths and towels like this. And then I thought, well, you gotta have soap. What do you do? And would you believe that Dollarama has foot wash soap? And so I did it. And I had a special verse for each of the guys, and went around the room and washed their feet. And it was just a very quiet, very solemn, really, occasion. Remember, Jesus said about foot washing, he says, as I have washed your feet, so you must wash one another's feet. We don't do this very often. As I said, I've only been in 2 in my life. One was the one I just talked about, and then another one earlier. Just 2 more. Actually, 1 more. I'll just go 1 more. Again, this is God speaking to us. Sometimes it's a big deal, like washing the elders' feet. And sometimes you wonder, did I need to know that? Here's the last one I'll share right now. A couple of years ago, Darren, our son, was working in his backyard and getting it all nice and decorating it with different things and so on. And he said, Mom and Dad, I'd like you to come on Saturday at noon and look at our backyard, see what we've done. This is on a Wednesday. Can you come at noon on Saturday? And sure, we'll be there. And so we were looking forward to that. And then the next day, God says to me, He's going to give you a new car. Nobody had been talking about cars. Just all of a sudden, out of the blue, He's going to give you a new car. And so Friday came, and I thought I really should tell Dorothy. But I thought, she'd think I was weird. So Saturday we're driving to their house. And again I thought, I just should demonstrate my faith by telling Dorothy. But I didn't have much faith, and so I didn't say anything. And so we get to their place, and we're in the backyard and looking around, and all of a sudden Darren disappears. And then after a few minutes he calls, Mom and Dad, come over here. And so we went out to the front of the garage, and he said, here's your new car. And I just went like this. I said, Darren, I knew. He said, how did you know? And I said, God told me. He just shook his head. What do you do with a dad like that? As I have shared my testimony this morning, I want to say again, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about a loving father, a loving shepherd who loves his children and guides us and speaks to us individually. We've read together the story this morning in Mark chapter 14. Where Jesus and his disciples are together. And they're having a meal. They're having a meal at the home of Simon, who used to be a leper, and Jesus had healed him. And Simon had 3 children, at least. And they were Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so the men are around this low table, and they're reclining probably on their elbows. They didn't have chairs, so they're kind of lying there around the table. And probably Mary and Martha were serving them. Women served. And this was about a week before Jesus' crucifixion. Bethany was a small village just outside of Jerusalem. And Jesus is having a meal with his disciples, again with just about a week left before he was crucified. This was a for men only event, and the only women present would be those who were serving. For a woman to enter into the circle of men would be scandalous. But we have Mary entering this circle. And she enters the circle, and she goes over to Jesus, and she has this bottle of perfume, very expensive perfume, valued at about a year's wage. It was very expensive. And she pours it on his head. And you would hope that the disciples would be a little more compassionate by this time, because they'd spent 3 years with Jesus and they only had a week's training left. But instead of saying, wow, this is really something, I should have done this. Why didn't I think of this? Judas, one of the other passages about this story, says that Judas says, what a waste. We could have given this and fed the poor. Think of how many poor people we could have fed. So he starts it off, and then the others join in and say, this is scandalous. And then Jesus says, Jesus, in verses 6 to 9, he's not saying that we should neglect the poor and be indifferent to them. He's praising Mary for her unselfish act. And this lavish gesture indicated the high honor and love that Mary had for Jesus. And Jesus says, and this is the key little phrase that I'd like us to remember today, she did what she could. Jesus didn't expect Mary to do a lot more than that. But he expected her to do what she could. So I'll start off. S is for she. She was a woman. Jewish men every morning thanked God for not making them Gentiles, slaves, or women. She didn't think or let what others might think about her or say stop her from doing the thing that she knew was the right thing for her to do. So she, a girl, took a position in a time when it wasn't acceptable for her to do that. And D is for did. She did. Love doesn't just think about doing something. Love does. Love doesn't just plan to do it sometime. Love does it now. Love is a verb. Love isn't just ideas. Love does. So Mary, she did what she could. If she could do this, then what can I do? What if I always did what I could? What if you did what you could? God prompts you to do something, to make a phone call, to bring some food over to somebody, to go visit someone, to help them in their time of need. What if I did what I could and you did what you could? What if we all did what we could? What a difference it would make. I have a dream. And my dream is that Lifehouse Church would become known as the most loving place in town. So that people would say of us like they used to say of the early church, behold how they love one another. Now on your sheet, I'd like you just to see, I'd like you to take the little sheet that you were given. And in a moment I'm going to invite you to respond. These are some of the questions I'd like you to think about as you go home today. What is the most beautiful, touching thing that you've ever seen one person do for another? What is the most beautiful, touching thing another person has ever done for you? What do you think you could do for Jesus that might cause him to make a similar statement about you? He did what he could. She did what she could. Imagine people talking about it years after you're gone. It could be something like, maybe for some of you, it could be something like, they helped me with my mortgage. And 50 years later, people are still talking about it. Or it could be something like this. When we pastored here, our kids were just little. Well, they were in their teens. And it was a small church. We were just planning a church here. And I remember one time our son came after church and he said, "Dad, I don't really like to go to church." He said, "Nobody even talks to me." And then the next Sunday, he said, "Dad, Mr. Devereaux talked to me today." And Mr. Devereaux was probably 80 years old. And he talked to this kid. And I'm talking about that 40 years later. Sometimes God promises us to do big things, but sometimes they're really small, but they're not small. So I have a dream, thinking about Lifehouse becoming the most loving place in town. And I pray that God will prompt you with an idea. Even something as simple as giving a cup of cold water. He says he notices, and he will bless, and he will care. So here's the bottom line. SDWC. She did what she could. And fill in the blanks. So will I. God bless you. Thank you for listening.